In the darkest corner of Titan Station's scrapyard, where even the rats refused to venture, something was dying. It wasn't supposed to be there. Nothing living ever was. The massive industrial facility processed the galaxy's most toxic waste, where failed starship hulls went to become nothing more than recycled metal and bad memories. The air itself was poison, thick with metallic dust and chemical fumes that could dissolve unprotected flesh in minutes. But Marcus Chun, a third-generation human mechanic with calloused hands and a reputation for fixing the unfixable, heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It wasn't the usual grinding of metal on metal or the hiss of hydraulic systems. It was softer, more desperate, a sound that spoke of pain and abandonment that transcended species. What he found would challenge everything the galaxy believed about humanity's place among the stars. What he did next would prove that sometimes the most advanced civilizations in the universe still had everything to learn from a simple human mechanic with a toolbox and a heart that refused to give up on the dying. Marcus Chun had been working the night shift at Titan Station's industrial complex for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the galaxy could throw at humanity's doorstep. Broken fusion reactors from Centauri merchants, collapsed hyperdrives from Zephyrian cargo haulers, and occasionally the twisted remains of ships that had tried to outrun pirates and failed spectacularly. The work was dangerous, dirty, and paid just enough to keep him fed and housed in a cramped quarters module on level 7. Tonight felt different, though. The usual background hum of the station's massive recycling processors seemed muted, and the artificial gravity generators were throwing off an irregular vibration that made his tools rattle in their magnetic holsters. Marcus adjusted his breathing mask and checked the readings on his environmental suit's display. The air quality in Section Delta 9 was particularly nasty tonight, with particulate levels that would liquefy an unprotected human's lungs in under 3 minutes. He was halfway through dismantling a Corvin pleasure cruiser when he heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that he initially dismissed it as equipment malfunction. But there was again, drifting through the toxic haze like a whisper of something alive in a place where only death was supposed to exist. Marcus shut down his plasma cutter and tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, weaker this time, but unmistakably organic. It was a soft, rhythmic wheeze that spoke of desperate breathing, of something struggling against the inevitable approach of death. Protocol demanded that he report any biological contamination immediately to station security. Titan Station had strict quarantine procedures for a reason. Too many species had learned the hard way that alien pathogens could devastate entire populations before anyone realized what was happening. But something about the sound made Marcus hesitate. It wasn't the aggressive hiss of a dangerous predator or the chittering of some parasitic insect. It was plaintive, almost like crying. Against every regulation in the station manual, Marcus followed the sound deeper into the maze of discarded starship hulls. The environmental readings on his suit grew worse with each step, and he had to activate his backup oxygen supply when the primary filtration system started throwing warning alerts. Whatever was making that sound was deep in the most toxic part of the yard, where even the automated disposal drones rarely ventured. He found the source behind the twisted remains of what had once been a Feline diplomatic vessel. The ship had been gutted, its elegant curved hull split open like a broken eggshell, revealing the sophisticated interior that had once housed some of the galaxy's most influential political figures. The Feline were known throughout inhabited space for their grace, their intelligence, and their absolute intolerance for what they considered inferior species, which included humans. But what Marcus discovered among the wreckage made him forget everything he knew about galactic politics. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet hauntingly familiar at the same time. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but covered in what appeared to be a fine, silver-gray fur that caught the harsh industrial lighting in an almost ethereal way. Its face was elongated and noble, with large eyes that held an intelligence that seemed both ancient and achingly young. If Marcus had to describe it, He would have said it looked like someone had taken the most beautiful house cat in the universe and given it the size and bearing of a person. But the beauty of the creature was overwhelmed by the horror of its condition. Its entire body was covered in what looked like thousands of small, dark growths. They clustered thickest around its neck and shoulders, spreading down its arms and across its torso in dense patches that made Marcus's stomach turn. The growths were moving, pulsing with a rhythm that suggested they were alive and feeding. Barnacles. Alien barnacles that had somehow attached themselves to living flesh and were slowly consuming their host from the outside in. The creature's eyes opened as Marcus approached, and he saw a depth of suffering that transcended species boundaries. But there's something else there too, a flicker of hope that anyone had finally found it in this place of abandonment and death. Marcus knelt carefully beside the dying being, his mind racing through everything he knew about xenobiology. It wasn't much. His expertise was in mechanical systems, not alien anatomy, but he could see that the creature was in the final stages of whatever the barnacles were doing to it. Its breathing was shallow and labored, and the silvery fur was matted with what appeared to be both blood and some kind of clear fluid that the barnacles were secreting. The smart thing would be to call station security and let the professionals handle it. The compassionate thing would be to make the creature as comfortable as possible while it died. But Marcus had never been particularly smart or particularly compassionate in the conventional sense. What he was stubborn and possessed of an almost pathological need to fix things that were broken. He activated his suit's external communication array and spoke in Galactic Standard, hoping the creature could understand. Hey there, I'm Marcus. I'm a human, and I'm going to try to help you. The creature's eyes focused on him with what seemed like tremendous effort, and it made a sound that might have been an attempt at communication. The universal translator built into Marcus's suit couldn't make sense of it, but the intent was clear enough, gratitude mixed with resignation. Marcus began a careful examination of the barnacles, using his suit's built-in sensors to analyze their structure. What he found made his engineering mind start working in ways that had nothing to do with starship repair and everything to do with biological problem solving. The barnacles weren't just feeding on the creature's flesh. They were somehow integrated into its circulatory system, acting like external organs that were slowly replacing the creature's natural biological functions. It was diabolical in its efficiency. The barnacles were keeping their host alive just long enough to completely consume and replace its internal organs, essentially turning the creature into a living shell for their own reproductive cycle. Marcus had heard rumors of such parasites existing in the deep space regions where even the bravest explorers feared to travel, but he had never imagined seeing one in person. More importantly, he had never imagined trying to remove one from a living host. Marcus spent the next several minutes studying the barnacle attachment points, using every sensor in his environmental suit to map their connection to the creature's body. The situation was almost hopeless. The parasites had been feeding for what must have been months, and their integration with the host's biological systems was nearly complete. Any attempt to remove them would likely kill the creature faster than leaving them alone. But Marcus had spent 12 years learning that nearly impossible and absolutely impossible were two very different things. He began pulling tools from his kit, improvising a surgical setup using equipment designed for delicate starship repairs. His plasma scalpel could be recalibrated to cut organic tissue with microscopic precision, and his electromagnetic field generator could potentially disrupt the barnacle's neural connections without damaging the host's nervous system. The creature watched him work with eyes that seemed to understand exactly what he was attempting. When Marcus looked up to explain what he was going to try, those large, intelligent eyes blinked once in what he chose to interpret as consent. "This is going to hurt," Marcus said, knowing the creature probably couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his regret. "I'm going to do everything I can to make it as quick as possible." The first incision was the hardest. Marcus had to cut through not just the barnacle's shell-like exterior, but also the network of feeding tendrils that had grown into the creature's flesh. The plasma scalpel worked perfectly, sealing blood vessels as it cut, and preventing the massive hemorrhaging that would have been instantly fatal. The barnacle came away with a wet, sucking sound that made Marcus's stomach churn, but the creature's vital signs actually improved slightly. Encouraged, he moved to the next one, and then the next, developing a rhythm that allowed him to work quickly while minimizing trauma to the surrounding tissue. It took him nearly 6 hours to remove the first cluster of barnacles from around the creature's neck and shoulders. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking from fatigue, and his oxygen reserves were running dangerously low. But the creature was still breathing, and its eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. Marcus sat back on his heels and looked at what he had accomplished. The creature's neck and upper chest were now covered in small, precisely sealed incisions where the barnacles had been attached, but the tissue underneath looked healthy and was already beginning to show signs of natural healing. More importantly, the creature seemed to be breathing easier, and some of the awful pallor was leaving its silvery fur. But hundreds of barnacles still remained, covering the creature's arms, torso, and legs in dense, pulsing clusters. The work Marcus had done was just the beginning, and he was already exhausted. The creature made another sound, softer this time, and raised one weakened hand toward Marcus's face. When its fingers touched the faceplate of his helmet, Marcus felt something he couldn't quite name, a sense of connection that transcended the barriers of species and language. "I'll be back," Marcus promised, though he knew the creature couldn't understand him. "I'm going to get some help." The creature's eyes followed him as he stood and gathered his tools, and Marcus found himself making a promise that he wasn't sure he could keep. But as he made his way back through the toxic maze of the scrapyard, he knew that he would find a way to save this being, even if it meant risking everything he had built for himself on Titan Station. After all, some things were more important than following regulations, and Marcus Chun had just discovered what it meant to find hope in the darkest corner of the galaxy. Marcus returned to his quarters in the early hours of the station's artificial morning, his mind spinning with the impossibility of what he had undertaken. The creature, he had decided to call it Kess, after the soft sound it made when trying to communicate, would die without continued medical intervention. But providing that intervention would require resources, equipment, and expertise that a simple mechanic couldn't possibly obtain through official channels. He sat at his small workstation and began researching everything the station's database contained about parasitic organisms, surgical procedures, and xenobiological medicine. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. The barnacle-like parasites were indeed known to xenobiologists, classified as Siphonophora symbioticus, though this symbiotic part of the name was grimly ironic, since the relationship was entirely one-sided. According to the limited research available, the parasites were believed to originate from the deep space regions beyond the galactic rim, where several survey expeditions had simply vanished without explanation. The few survivors who had encountered them described creatures that could survive in the vacuum of space and attach themselves to any organic host, slowly replacing the host's biological functions while keeping it alive for maximum feeding efficiency. No successful removal procedures had ever been documented. The medical consensus was that once the parasites had achieved significant integration with a host's circulatory system, any attempt at removal would result in immediate death from organ failure. Marcus stared at the research data and felt something that he recognized as the same stubborn determination that had gotten him through 12 years of impossible repair jobs. Medical consensus was just another way of saying that nobody had been creative enough to solve the problem yet. He spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies from various parts of the station, using his maintenance credentials to access medical storage areas, engineering workshops, and even the biological research labs that most of the station's inhabitants avoided. Officially, he was conducting routine equipment inspections. Unofficially, he was assembling an improvised surgical suite that would have horrified any legitimate medical professional. The most critical acquisition was a portable life support unit from the emergency medical bay. The device was designed to maintain basic biological functions for multiple species during trauma situations, and while it wasn't specifically calibrated for whatever species Kess represented, Marcus was confident he could modify it to work. He also managed to acquire several doses of broad-spectrum anesthetics, synthetic blood substitutes, and regenerative tissue catalysts that would help accelerate healing. The theft would eventually be noticed, but Marcus figured he had at least a few days before anyone connected the missing supplies to him. When he returned to the scrapyard that evening, he found Kess exactly where he had left the creature, though its condition had noticeably deteriorated. The barnacles had continued their feeding process, and several new clusters had appeared on areas that had been clear the previous night. More alarmingly, some of the barnacles had grown visibly larger, their dark shells now pulsing with an ominous bioluminescent pattern. Marcus set up his improvised medical equipment among the wreckage of the Feline ship, using the vessel's emergency power cells to run his devices. The portable life support unit hummed to life, and its diagnostic sensors immediately began analyzing Kess's vital signs and adjusting their output accordingly. "Okay, my friend," Marcus said, checking the anesthetic levels in his injection system. "Tonight we're going to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both." Kess's eyes tracked his movements with what seemed like understanding, and when Marcus knelt beside the creature with the anesthetic injector, those large eyes blinked once in the same gesture of consent he had seen before. The anesthetic worked faster than Marcus had expected, and within minutes Kess's breathing had deepened and the obvious signs of pain had faded from the creature's face. The life support unit adjusted its output accordingly, taking over several basic biological functions while Marcus prepared to begin the most ambitious surgical procedure of his completely unqualified career. This time, Marcus started with the largest barnacle clusters on Kess's torso, reasoning that removing the most aggressive feeders would give the creature the best chance of surviving the overall procedure. He had spent hours studying the connection points and had developed a technique that involved severing the parasite's feeding tendrils in a specific sequence that minimized shock to the host system. The work was painstaking and exhausting. Each barnacle had to be carefully analyzed before removal, and Marcus found himself developing an intuitive understanding of how the parasites interfaced with Kess's biology. It was like learning to read a language written in living tissue and alien biochemistry. Hours passed in a blur of precise incisions, careful cauterization, and constant monitoring of Kess's vital signs. Marcus lost track of time as he worked, his world narrowing to the small area illuminated by his surgical lights and the steady beeping of the life support monitors. He was halfway through removing a particularly large cluster from Kess's left arm when the alarm started. The sound of station security klaxons echoed through the scrapyard, and Marcus could hear the distinctive whine of security drones beginning their patrol patterns. Someone had discovered his theft of medical supplies, and it wouldn't take long for them to track the missing equipment to Section Delta 9. Marcus looked down at Kess, whose arm was still half covered with barnacles, and who was completely dependent on the life support equipment for survival. He could abandon the creature and try to cover his tracks, probably saving his job and his future on Titan Station. Or he could continue working and accept that his life was about to become very complicated. The decision took him about 3 seconds. Marcus activated his suit's communication jamming field, which would make him invisible to the security drone's tracking systems for a limited time, and continued working. If he was going to be arrested for unauthorized medical procedures, he was at least going to finish what he had started. The security drones found him 2 hours later, just as he was removing the last barnacle from Kess's right leg. Marcus looked up from his work to find himself surrounded by 3 hovering enforcement units, their weapons trained on him while their speakers crackled with demands for his immediate surrender. "I'm almost finished," Marcus called out, his hands never stopping their careful work. "Give me 5 more minutes." Step away from the unregistered biological specimen immediately, the lead drone commanded in the flat, emotionless tone that all security AIs used. You are in violation of quarantine protocols, theft of medical supplies, and unauthorized medical procedures. Marcus sealed the final incision and sat back on his heels, looking at what he had accomplished. Kessa's body was covered with small, precisely healed cuts where the barnacles had been removed, but the creature's breathing was strong and regular, and the silvery fur was already beginning to regain its natural luster. The life support unit showed stable vital signs across all monitored systems. "Okay," Marcus said, raising his hand slowly. "I'm done. You can arrest me now." But before the security drones could move, Kessa's eyes opened. The creature looked around with a clarity and awareness that hadn't been there before, and when those large eyes focused on Marcus, they held something that made all the legal trouble worth it. Gratitude. Pure, unmistakable gratitude that transcended every barrier between species. Kess struggled to sit up, the movements weak but determined, and reached out to touch Marcus's helmet again. This time, the creature spoke, and while the universal translator still couldn't interpret the words, the tone was unmistakably that of someone saying thank you. The security drones paused, their programming apparently uncertain about how to handle a situation involving a previously unknown alien species that was clearly intelligent and apparently grateful to its rescuer. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. Station Administrator Chun, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, arrived with a full medical team and several xenobiology specialists. The administrator was a small, efficient woman who had built her reputation on handling unusual situations with a combination of pragmatism and carefully calculated risk-taking. "Report," she commanded, and the lead security drone immediately began reciting Marcus's various violations of station protocol. But Administrator Chun was looking at Kess, whose improvement was obvious to anyone with medical training. The creature was sitting up unassisted now, moving carefully but with obvious strength and coordination. The removal of the barnacles had clearly saved its life, and the surgical technique Marcus had improvised was precise enough to impress the professional medical team. "What species?" the administrator asked one of the xenobiologists. "Unknown," came the reply after a quick scan. "The bone structure and organ placement suggests an evolutionary relationship to the Feline, but this is clearly a distinct species. Highly intelligent, based on brain activity patterns, and the surgical intervention appears to have been completely successful." Administrator Chun looked from Kess to Marcus, who was still kneeling among his improvised surgical equipment with his hands raised. "Mr. Chun, do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I saved someone's life." "You've potentially made first contact with an unknown intelligent species," the administrator corrected. "You've demonstrated a surgical technique that our medical databases say should be impossible. And you've done it all with stolen equipment in the most toxic part of my station." Marcus waited for the arrest warrant, but Administrator Chun surprised him. "Dr. Vance," she said to the chief medical officer, "I want a full analysis of Mr. Chen's surgical methodology. If it's reproducible, we may have stumbled onto a treatment for parasitic integration that could save thousands of lives across the galaxy. Mr. Chun, you're temporarily reassigned to xenobiology consultation pending a full investigation." Kess chose that moment to stand up, moving with a grace that was both alien and hauntingly beautiful. The creature looked around at all the humans surrounding it, then focused on Marcus with unmistakable recognition. In carefully pronounced galactic standard, it spoke its first words in the language that connected the civilized galaxy. "Thank you, Marcus Chun. You have given me back my life." Administrator Chun stared at the creature for a long moment, then turned back to Marcus with something that might have been respect in her eyes. "Mr. Chun," she said, "I think you're going to find that your life just became very interesting indeed." 3 weeks after the rescue, Marcus found himself in a position he had never imagined possible, sitting across from representatives of a dozen major galactic civilizations, explaining surgical techniques to beings whose medical knowledge was supposed to be centuries ahead of anything humans could comprehend. The conference room on Level 1 of Titan Station had been hastily converted into a medical symposium, complete with holographic displays showing the barnacle removal procedure in excruciating detail. Kes sat beside him, no longer the dying creature he had found in the scrapyard, but a being of obvious intelligence and grace whose recovery had astonished every medical professional who had examined the case. The silver-gray fur now gleamed with health, and the large eyes held a sharpness that spoke of a mind fully engaged with the complex political and medical implications of what had happened. The technique relies on understanding the parasite's integration pattern. Marcus explained for the fourth time that day, manipulating the holographic display to highlight specific neural pathways. They don't just feed randomly. They follow the host's circulatory system in a predictable sequence. If you disrupt them in the right order, you can prevent cascade organ failure. Dr. Corvanis, the chief medical officer from the Zephyrian Confederacy, made a gesture of skepticism that translated across species boundaries. Mr. Chun, with respect, your technique should not work. The parasites create dependencies that make the host unable to survive without them. Every simulation our medical computers have run indicates that removal should result in immediate death. Your simulations are wrong, Marcus said simply, which caused a ripple of what might have been amusement from several of the alien delegates. It wasn't often that someone told the Zephyrians their technology was inadequate. Kes leaned forward, speaking in the careful, precise galactic standard that had become increasingly fluent over the past weeks. If I may address Dr. Corvanis' concern, the answer lies in understanding the difference between medical knowledge and medical intuition. Marcus Chun succeeded because he approached my condition as an engineering problem rather than a purely medical one. The representative from the hegemony of worlds, a tall being with crystalline features that reflected light in mesmerizing patterns, made a sound that the universal translator interpreted as laughter. You suggest that ignorance was an advantage? I suggest that fresh perspective was an advantage, Kes replied smoothly. Your medical databases contained no successful procedures because previous attempts were constrained by assumptions about what should work rather than experimental determination of what actually works. Marcus watched the exchange with fascination. Over the weeks of recovery, he had learned that Kes was far from the simple victim he had initially appeared to be. The creature, who had revealed that the appropriate pronoun was he, and that his species were called the Nyathari, was actually a diplomatic envoy who had been traveling aboard the Feline vessel when it was attacked by pirates. What Marcus hadn't learned until this morning was that Kes wasn't just any diplomatic envoy. He was the crown prince of the Nyathari Empire, one of the galaxy's oldest and most reclusive civilizations, and his disappearance had been causing political upheaval across 3 sectors. The realization that he had accidentally saved royalty was still making Marcus feel slightly nauseous, but it explained why every major power in the galaxy had suddenly become interested in a simple mechanics, improvised medical procedures. Admiral Thorne of the Human Colonial Authority cleared her throat, drawing attention to the far end of the table where the human delegation sat. Marcus had met her only once before, when she had arrived to personally oversee what was being called the Chun incident in official reports. While the medical implications are fascinating, Admiral Thorne said, I believe we need to address the larger political situation. Prince Kes, your government has been searching for you for over 6 months. The assumption was that you had been killed in the pirate attack. Kes inclined his head gracefully. The assumption was reasonable. The Siphonophora parasites were meant to ensure my death, while making it appear that I had simply vanished. It was an assassination attempt disguised as piracy, and it nearly succeeded. This was news to Marcus, who had assumed that Kes's infestation was simply bad luck. The idea that someone had deliberately infected him with the parasites added a sinister dimension to the rescue that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. Who? Admiral Thorne asked bluntly. That remains to be determined, Kes replied, though something in his tone suggested he had suspicions he wasn't ready to share. What matters now is that the attempt failed, thanks to Marcus Chen's intervention. The question becomes how we proceed from here. Dr. Corvani's activated a holographic display showing the current political map of the local galactic sector. The Nyathri Empire has been in isolation for nearly a century. Your return could significantly alter the balance of power, particularly given the current tensions with the Feline supremacy. Marcus looked at the complex web of political relationships displayed in the hologram and felt completely out of his depth. He was a mechanic who fixed broken machines, not a diplomatic advisor who navigated galactic politics. But he was apparently stuck in the middle of this situation whether he wanted to be or not. "There's something else we need to discuss," Kess said, and his tone made everyone in the room pay closer attention. The surgical technique Marcus developed isn't just useful for treating parasitic infestations. The principles he discovered could revolutionize medical treatment for dozens of conditions that current medicine considers incurable. He activated another holographic display, this one showing comparative medical data from across the galaxy. Parasitic integration diseases affect over 40 known species. Symbiotic organ replacement therapies have a mortality rate of 60% because of integration complications. Neural implant rejection syndromes kill thousands every year because surgeons can't safely remove failed devices. Marcus stared at the data, beginning to understand the implications. "You're saying that the technique could be adapted for other procedures?" "I'm saying," Kess replied, "that you've accidentally invented a new branch of medicine." The Nyathri medical archives contain case studies going back millennia, and nothing in our records matches the success rate of your improvised procedure. Administrator Chun, who had been quietly observing from the side of the room, stepped forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Your Highness?" Kess looked around the table at all the assembled representatives, then turned to Marcus. "I propose that Marcus Chun be granted the resources to develop his techniques properly. The Nyathri Empire is prepared to fund a joint research facility here on Titan Station, with full access to our medical archives and technology." The offer hung in the air like a live electrical charge. A joint research facility funded by one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations would transform Titan Station from a simple industrial outpost into one of the most important medical research centers in known space. In exchange for what? Admiral Thorne asked, because humans had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "In exchange for Marcus Chin's agreement to lead the research program," Kess said simply, "and for humanity's guarantee that the knowledge developed will be freely shared among all civilized species, not hoarded for political or economic advantage." Marcus felt the weight of every gaze in the room settling on him. These beings were talking about restructuring galactic medical research around techniques he had improvised with stolen equipment in a toxic scrapyard. The responsibility was overwhelming. "I'm just a mechanic," he said quietly. Kess reached over and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, the gesture somehow conveying both friendship and confidence. "You're the person who looked at an impossible problem and solved it anyway. You're the person who risked everything to save a dying stranger. And you're the person who, in 3 weeks of medical consultations, has already improved upon techniques that my people spent centuries developing." Admiral Thorne leaned forward. "Mr. Chun, this is ultimately your decision. But I want you to understand that what you decide today could influence human-alien relations for generations." Marcus looked around the room at all the expectant faces, representing civilizations that had been exploring the galaxy since before humans had learned to make fire. They were all waiting for his answer, and the irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. A few weeks ago, he had been nobody special, just another human trying to make a living on the edge of civilized space. Now he was being asked to reshape galactic medicine. But when he looked at Kess, he remembered the dying creature he had found in the scrapyard, and the moment when those large eyes had first shown hope instead of resignation. The decision became easier. "I'll do it," Marcus said, "but I have conditions." Dr. Corvani's made that skeptical gesture again. "You wish to negotiate with an offer from the Nyathri Empire?" I want to guarantee that any techniques we develop will be available to everyone who needs them, regardless of their species or their ability to pay," Marcus said firmly. "And I want the research team to include medical professionals from every major civilization, not just the ones represented here." Kess smiled, and Marcus realized it was the first time he had seen the Nyathri prince look genuinely amused. "You continue to surprise me, Marcus-chun. Those conditions are entirely acceptable to the Empire." Admiral Thorne nodded her approval. "The Human Colonial Authority agrees to these terms." One by one, the other representatives voiced their agreement, and Marcus felt the weight of history settling around him like a comfortable tool belt. He might not have asked for this responsibility, but he was beginning to think he could handle it. After all, fixing broken things was what he did best, and there were apparently a lot of broken things in the galaxy that needed fixing. 2 years later, Marcus Chun stood in the observation deck of the Marcus Chun Institute for Integrated Xenobiology, a name that still made him uncomfortable every time he saw it on official documents, and watched as the latest group of medical students from across the galaxy practiced the techniques that had become known as Chun methodology throughout civilized space. The facility had grown far beyond anything he had imagined possible. What had started as a simple research lab had evolved into a sprawling complex that occupied 3 entire levels of Titan Station. The student body included representatives from over 30 different species, and the waiting list for admission had become a significant diplomatic issue among several minor governments. "You're brooding again," Kess observed, joining Marcus at the observation window. The Nyathri prince had become not just a colleague, but a true friend over the past 2 years, and he had developed an uncanny ability to read Marcus's moods. "I'm not brooding," Marcus replied. "I'm contemplating." The difference being, when I brood, I worry about things I can't control. When I contemplate, I worry about things I'm responsible for, but don't fully understand. Kess made a sound that was the Nyathri equivalent of laughter. "An important distinction. What are you contemplating today?" Marcus gestured toward the medical bay below, where a young Zephyrian surgeon was successfully removing neural parasites from a volunteer patient using a modified version of the original barnacle extraction technique. 2 years ago, I was fixing broken starship engines. Now there are students down there who know more about xenobiological surgery than I ever will. "And this troubles you?" "It amazes me," Marcus corrected. 6 months ago, that procedure would have been impossible. The patient would have died, and the surgeon would have written another report about how parasitic neural integration can't be reversed. Now it's become routine enough that we're teaching it to first-year students. The observation window provided a clear view of 3 different surgical theaters, where teams of multi-species medical professionals were working on cases that would have been hopeless just a few years before. The success rate for parasitic integration treatments had improved from 0% to over 90%, and the techniques were being adapted for an ever-growing list of previously incurable conditions. "Dr. Chun," came a voice from behind them, and Marcus turned to see Dr. Sarah Kim, the Institute's chief of staff, approaching with a datapad and an expression that suggested important news. Marcus had insisted on keeping his title as simple as possible despite pressure from various governments to accept more impressive designations. Prince Kess had once pointed out that he was probably the only person in galactic history to turn down an offer of nobility from 3 different empires, but Marcus preferred being Dr. Chun to being His Excellency the Duke of Innovative Surgery, or any of the other ridiculous titles that had been suggested. "What's the situation, Sarah?" Marcus asked, noting the tension in her posture. "We just received a priority communication from the Outer Rim Medical Authority," Dr. Kim said, activating the holographic display on her datapad. "There's been an outbreak of something new. Initial reports suggest it's a variant of the siphonophore parasites, but with some significant differences." The holographic display showed medical scans that made Marcus's stomach clench with recognition. The parasites were similar to the ones he had removed from Kess, but these were larger, more aggressive, and appear to be spreading between hosts through direct contact rather than requiring the complex life cycle of the original species. Where? Kess asked, his tone becoming immediately serious. The Kepler Mining Consortium's operations in the Vega system, Dr. Kim replied. 3 orbital platforms, approximately 12,000 workers from 15 different species. The first cases were reported 6 days ago, and the infection rate has been doubling every 18 hours. Marcus studied the medical data, his mind automatically analyzing the parasite structure and integration patterns. These new variants were definitely related to the original species, but they had been modified somehow, either through natural evolution or deliberate genetic manipulation. What's the current medical response? He asked. Standard quarantine protocols. The consortium has sealed the platforms and is requesting permission to evacuate uninfected personnel, but the Galactic Health Authority is refusing to allow anyone to leave until the contamination can be controlled. Marcus understood the logic behind the quarantine, but he also knew what it meant for the 12,000 people trapped on those platforms. Without treatment, parasitic integration would kill most of them within 2 weeks, and the psychological trauma of watching their colleagues transform into host organisms for alien parasites would probably drive many of the survivors insane. How long would it take to get there? Marcus asked. Doctor, kim çekit her calcules. With a priority medical transport, about 48 hours. But, Dr. Chun, the authorities haven't authorized any intervention missions yet. The risk of spreading the contamination is considered too high. The risk of doing nothing is higher, Marcus said firmly. Sarah, start putting together a surgical team. I want our best people with equipment for extended field operations. Marcus, Kess interrupted gently, you should be aware that this situation has political implications beyond the medical crisis. The Kepler Consortium has been operating in disputed territory, and several governments are viewing this outbreak as either a convenient excuse to intervene or a potential act of biological warfare. Marcus turned to look at his friend, recognizing the tone that meant Kess was sharing information he probably shouldn't. What aren't you telling me? Kess was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing his words carefully. The Nyathri Intelligence Service has reason to believe that the original attack on my ship was connected to research into weaponizing the siphonophore parasites. If this outbreak is related to that research, then we may be dealing with a deliberately engineered biological weapon rather than a natural epidemic. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Someone had tried to assassinate Kess using the parasites as a weapon, and now a modified version of the same organisms was loose on 3 orbital platforms. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. You think someone is field testing an improved version, Marcus said. I think someone is either field testing an improved version or someone else has obtained the research data and is conducting their own experiments, Kess replied. Either way, 12,000 innocent people are being used as test subjects. Dr. Kim looked between them with growing alarm. Are you suggesting this is an act of war? I'm suggesting this is an act of science without ethics, Marcus said grimly. Which makes it our problem, whether the politicians want to admit it or not. He turned back to the observation window, watching the students below as they continued their practice surgeries. 2 years ago, he had made a decision to save one dying creature in a toxic scrapyard. Now, he was faced with a decision that could affect thousands of lives and potentially prevent the development of biological weapons that could threaten the entire galaxy. The choice was actually easier than it had been the first time. Sarah, I want that surgical team ready to deploy within 12 hours, Marcus said. Include Dr. Vance, Dr. Kala, and the entire emergency response unit. And pack enough supplies for extended operations. We might be there for a while. What about authorization from the Galactic Health Authority? Dr. Kim asked. Marcus smiled grimly. I'll worry about authorization after we save those people. It's easier to apologize for unauthorized medical intervention than it is to explain why we let 12,000 people die while we waited for permission to help them. Kess placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder in the gesture that had become familiar between them. The Nyathri medical ship Healing Wind is currently 3 hours from Titan Station. If you're willing to accept our assistance, I can have them here and ready to depart within 6 hours. Why would you want to get involved in this? Marcus asked, though he was already grateful for the offer. Because 2 years ago, a human mechanic saved my life by ignoring regulations and doing what needed to be done, Kes replied simply. It seems appropriate to return the favor. Dr. Kim was already making notes on her datapad. I'll start assembling the team. But, Dr. Chun, you should know that if this goes wrong, it could destroy everything we've built here. The Institute's reputation depends on maintaining good relationships with the galactic medical establishment. Marcus looked around at the facility that had grown from a simple desire to save one dying creature. Then, back at the medical data, showing thousands of people facing the same kind of slow, agonizing death he had prevented Kes from suffering. Sarah, he said quietly, the Institute's reputation was built on saving lives when nobody else thought it was possible. If we stop doing that because we're worried about political consequences, then we don't deserve the reputation we have. He turned to address both of them directly. Besides, I didn't become a doctor to maintain good relationships with bureaucrats. I became a doctor to fix things that are broken. And right now, there are 12,000 people who need fixing. As Marcus walked toward the medical bay to begin assembling his team, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that night in the scrapyard. He had gone from being a simple mechanic to leading one of the galaxy's most important medical institutions. But the fundamental motivation remained the same. Some things were more important than following regulations, and some problems required someone to ignore the conventional wisdom about what was possible. The Kepler Mining Consortium platforms were about to discover what happened when a human mechanic decided that impossible was just another word for hasn't been fixed yet. In the end, that was what humanity had always brought to the galaxy. Not superior technology or ancient wisdom, but the stubborn refusal to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. Sometimes that was exactly what the universe needed most. Marcus Chun, former mechanic and current savior of the impossible, was about to prove that point once again.